The Stout Gentleman by Washington Irving. It was a rainy Sunday in the gloomy month of November. I had been detained in the course of a journey at an inn in the small town of Derby. A wet Sunday in a country inn. Whoever has had the luck to experience one can alone judge my situation. The rain pattered against the casements. The bells tolled for church with a melancholy sound. I went to the windows in search of something to amuse the eye, but it seemed as if I had been placed completely out of reach of all amusement. The windows of my bedroom looked out among tiled roofs and stacks of chimneys, while those of my sitting room commanded a full view of the stable yard. I know of nothing more calculated to make a man sick of this world than a stable yard on a rainy day. The place was littered with wet straw that had been kicked about by travelers and stable boys. In one corner was a stagnant pool of water surrounding an island of muck. There were several half-drowned fowls crowded together under a cart, among which was a miserable crestfallen cock, drenched out of all life and spirit, his drooping tail matted as it were into a single feather, along which the water trickled from his back. Near the cart was a half-dozing cow chewing the cud, and standing patiently to be rained on, with wreaths of vapor rising from a reeking hide. A wall-eyed horse, tired of the loneliness of the stable, was peeking his spectral head out of the window, with the rain dripping on it from the eaves. An unhappy cur, chained to a doghouse hard by, uttered something every now and then between a bark and a yelp. A drab of a kitchen wench stamped backwards and forwards through the yard, looking as sulky as the weather itself. Everything, in short, was comfortless and forlorn, except for a crew of hard-drinking ducks, assembled like boon companions around the puddle and making a riotous noise over their liquor. I was lonely and listless and wanted amusement. My room soon became insupportable. I abandoned it and sought what is technically called the traveller's room. This is a public room set apart at most inns for the accommodation of a class of wayfarers called travellers or riders, a kind of commercial knights errant, who are incessantly scouring the kingdom in gigs, on horseback or by coach. They are the only successors that I know of at the present day to the knights errant of yore. They lead the same kind of roving, adventurous life, only changing the lance for a driving whip, the buckler for a pattern card, and the coat of mail for an upper Benjamin. Instead of vindicating the charms of peerless beauty, they rove about, spreading the fame and standing of some substantial tradesman or manufacturer, and are ready at any time to bargain in his name, it being the fashion nowadays to trade instead of fight with one another. As the room of the hotel in the good old fighting days would be hung round at night with the armor of way-worn warriors, such as coats of mail and yawning helmets, so the traveller's room is garnished with the harnessing of their successors, with box coats and whips of all kinds, spurs, garters, and oilcloth-covered hats. I was in hopes of finding some of these worthies to talk with, but was disappointed. There were indeed 2 or 3 in the room, but I could make nothing of them. One was just finishing his breakfast, quarrelling with his bread and butter. Another buttoned on a pair of gaiters. A third sat drumming on the table with his fingers and looking at the rain as it streamed down the window glass. They all appeared infected by the weather and disappeared one after another without exchanging a word. I sauntered to the window and stood gazing at the people picking their way to church, with petticoats hoisted mid-leg high and dripping umbrellas. The bells ceased to toll, and the streets became silent. I then amused myself with watching the daughters of a tradesman opposite, who, being confined to the house for fear of wetting the Sunday finery, played off their charms at the front windows to fascinate the chance tenants of the inn. They at length were summoned away by a vigilant, vinegar-faced mother, and I had nothing from without to amuse me. What was I to do to pass away the long-lived day? I was sadly nervous and lonely, and everything about an inn seems calculated to make a dull day 10 times duller. Old newspapers, smelling of beer and tobacco smoke, and which I had already read half a dozen times. Good-for-nothing books. That was worse than any rainy weather. I bored myself to death with an old volume of the Ladies' Magazine. I read all the commonplace names of ambitious travelers scrawled on the panes of glass, the eternal families of the Smiths and the Browns and the Jacksons and the Johnsons and all the other sons, and I deciphered several scraps of fatiguing in-window poetry which I have met with in all parts of the world. The day continued lowering and gloomy. The slovenly, ragged, spongy clouds drifted heavily along. There was no variety, even in the rain. It was one dull, continued, monotonous patter, 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 except that now and then I was enlivened by the idea of a brisk shower from the rattling of the drops upon a passing umbrella. It was quite refreshing, if I may be allowed a hackneyed phrase of the day, when in the course of the morning a horn blew, and a stagecoach whirled through the street with outside passengers stuck all over it, cowering under cotton umbrellas and sighed together and reeking with the steams of wet box coats and upper Benjamins. The sound brought out from their lurking places a crew of vagabond boys and vagabond dogs, and the carrot-headed hostler and all the other vagabond race that infest an inn. But the bustle was transient. The coach again whirled on its way, and the boy and the dog and hostler all slunk back again to their holes. The street again became silent, and the rain continued to rain on. In fact, there was no hope of its clearing up. The barometer pointed to rainy weather. On consulting the almanac, I found a dreary prediction stretching from the top of the page to the bottom through the whole month. Expect much rain about this time. The hours seemed as if they would never creep by. The very ticking of the clock became irksome. At length the stillness of the house was interrupted by the ringing of a bell. Shortly after, I heard the voice of a waiter at the bar.
"The Stout Gentleman in number 13 wants his breakfast. Tea with bread and butter with ham and eggs. The eggs not to be done too much."
In such a situation as mine, every incident is of importance. Here was a subject of speculation presented to my mind, an ample exercise for my imagination. Had the guest upstairs been mentioned as Mr. Smith or Mr. Brown or Mr. Jackson or Mr. Johnson, or merely as the gentleman in number 13, it would have been a perfect blank to me. I would have thought nothing of it, but the Stout Gentleman. The very name had something in it of the picturesque. It at once gave the size. It embodied the personage to my mind's eye, and my fancy did the rest. He was stout, or as some might term it, lusty. In all probability, therefore, he was advanced in life, some people expanding as they grow old. By breakfasting rather late, and in his own room, he must be a man accustomed to live at his ease, and above the necessity of rising early. No doubt a round, rosy, lusty old gentleman. There was another violent ringing. The Stout Gentleman was impatient for his breakfast. He was evidently a man of importance, well-to-do in the world, accustomed to be promptly waited on, of a keen appetite, and a little cross when hungry. Perhaps, I thought, he might be some London alderman, or who knows, but he may be a member of Parliament. The breakfast was sent up, and there was a short interval of silence. He was doubtless making the tea. Presently, there was a violent ringing, and before it could be answered, another ringing still more violent. The waiter came down in a huff. The butter was rancid, the eggs were overdone, and the ham was too salty. The Stout Gentleman was evidently nice in his eating, one of those who ate and growl and keep the waiter on the trot. The hostess got into a fume. I should observe that she was a bright, coquettish woman, a little bit of a shrew, but very pretty withal, with a nincompoop for a husband, as shrews are apt to have. She berated the servants roundly for their neglect in sending up so bad a breakfast, but said not a word against the stout gentleman, by which I clearly perceived that he must be a man of consequence, entitled to make a noise and give trouble at a country inn. Other eggs and ham and bread and butter were sent up. They appeared to be more graciously received. At least there was no further complaint. I had not made many turns about the traveller's room when there was another ringing. Shortly afterwards there was a stir and an inquest about the house. The stout gentleman wanted the Times, or the Chronicle newspaper. I set him down, therefore, for a Whig, or rather, from his being so absolute and lordly where he had a chance, I suspected him of being a Radical. My curiosity began to be awakened. I inquired of the waiter who was this stout gentleman that was making all this stir, but I could get no information. No one seemed to know his name. The landlords of bustling inns seldom trouble their heads about the names or occupations of their transient guests. The color of a coat, the shape or size of the person is enough to suggest a traveling name. It is either the tall gentleman, or the short gentleman, or the gentleman in black, or the gentleman in snuff color, or, as the present instance, the stout gentleman. A designation of the kind once hit upon answers every purpose and saves all further inquiry. Rain, rain, rain. Pitiless, ceaseless rain. No such thing as putting a foot out of doors, and no occupation nor amusement within. By and by I heard someone walking overhead. It was in the stout gentleman's room. He evidently was a large man by the heaviness of his tread, and an old man from his wearing such creaking soles. He is doubtless, thought I, some rich old square-toes of regular habits, and is now taking exercise after breakfast. I now read all the advertisements of coaches and hotels that were stuck about the mantelpiece. The ladies' magazine had become an abomination to me. It was as tedious as the day itself. I wandered out not knowing what to do, and ascended again to my room. I had not been there long when there was a squall from a neighboring bedroom. A door opened and slammed violently. A chambermaid that I had remarked for having a ruddy, good-humored face went downstairs in a violent flurry. The stout gentleman had been rude to her. This sent a whole host of my deductions to the deuce in a moment. This personage could not be an old gentleman, for old gentlemen are not apt to be so obstreperous to chambermaids. He could not be a young gentleman, for young gentlemen are not apt to inspire such indignation. He must be a middle-aged man, and confounded ugly into the bargain, or the girl would not have taken the matter with such terrible dudgeon. I confess I was sorely puzzled. In a few minutes I heard the voice of my landlady. I caught a glimpse of her as she came tramping upstairs, her face glowing, her cap flaring, her tongue wagging the whole time. She'd have no servant maids of hers treated that way when they were about their work. As I hate squabbles, particularly with women, and above all with pretty women, I slunk back into my room and partly closed the door. But my curiosity was too much excited not to listen. The landlady marched intrepidly to the enemy's citadel and entered it with a storm. The door closed after her. I heard her voice in high, windy clamor for a moment or two, and it gradually subsided, like a gust of wind in a garret. Then there was a laugh, and I heard nothing more. After a little while, my landlady came out with an odd smile on her face, adjusting her cap, which was a little to one side. As she went downstairs, I heard the landlord ask her what was the matter. She said nothing at all, only the girl's a fool. I was more than ever perplexed what could make this unaccountable personage, who could put a good-natured chambermaid in a passion and send away a vinegar-faced landlady in smiles. He could not be so old, nor cross, nor ugly either. I had to go to work at his picture again, and to paint him entirely differently. I now set him down for one of those stout gentlemen that are frequently met with swaggering about the doors of country inns. Merry fellows whose bulk is a little assisted by malt liquors. Men who have seen the world and been sworn at Highgate, who are used to tavern life, up to all the tricks of tapsters, and knowing in the ways of sinful publicans. Free livers on a small scale, who are prodigal within the compass of a guinea, who call all the waiters by name, gossip with the landlady at the bar, and prose over a pint of port after dinner. Dinner time came. I hoped the stout gentleman might dine in the traveller's room, and that I might at length get a view of his person. But no, he had dinner served in his own room. What could be the meaning of this solitude and mystery? He could not be a radical. There was something too aristocratical in thus keeping himself apart from the rest of the world, and condemning himself to his own dull company throughout a rainy day. And then, too, he lived too well for a discontented politician. He seemed to expatiate on a variety of dishes, and sat over his wine like a jolly old friend of good living. Indeed, my doubts were soon at an end, for he could not have finished his first bottle before I could faintly hear him humming a tune, and on listening, I found it to be God Save the King. 'Twas plain then that he was no radical, but a faithful subject, one that grew loyal over his bottle, and was ready to stand by king and constitution when he could stand by nothing else. But who could he be? My conjectures began to run wild. Was he not some personage of distinction, travelling incognito? God knows, said I, at my wit's end. It may be one of the royal family for all I know. They are all stout gentlemen. The weather continued rainy. The mysterious unknown kept to his room, and as far as I could judge, his chair, for I could not hear him move. In the meantime, as the day advanced, the traveller's room began to be frequented. Some who had just arrived came in buttoned up in box coats. Others came home, who had been dispersed about the town. Some took their dinners, some took their tea. Had I been in a different mood, I should have found entertainment in studying this peculiar class of men. There were two especially who were regular wags of the road, and up to all the standing jokes of travellers. They had 1,000 sly things to say to the waiting maid, whom they called Louisa and Ethelinda, and a dozen other fine names, changing the name every time and chuckling amusingly at their own waggery. My mind, however, had been completely engrossed by the stout gentleman. He had kept my fancy in chase during a long day, and it was not now to be diverted from the scent. The evening gradually wore away. The travellers read the papers 2 or 3 times over. Some drew round the fire and told long stories about their horses, about their adventures, their overturns and breakings down. They discussed the credits of different merchants in different inns, and the two wags told several choice anecdotes of pretty chambermaids and kind landladies. All this passed as they were quietly taking what they called their nightcaps, that is to say, strong glasses of brandy and water and sugar, or some other mixture of the kind, after which they one after another rang for the chambermaid and walked off to bed. The gloom that now prevailed was contagious. Around hung the shapeless and almost spectral box coats of departed travellers, long since buried in deep sleep. I heard only the ticking of the clock. The church bells chimed to midnight. All at once the stout gentleman began to walk overhead, pacing slowly backwards and forwards. After a while, The steps grew fainter and fainter, and at last died away. I could bear it no longer. I was bound up to the desperation of a hero of romance. Be he who or what he may, I said to myself, I'll have a sight of him. I seized a chamber candle and hurried up to number 13. The door stood ajar. I hesitated. I entered. The room was deserted. There stood a large, broad-bottomed elbow chair at a table, on which was an empty tumbler and a Times newspaper, and the room smelt powerfully of Stilton cheese. The mysterious stranger had evidently but just retired. I turned off, sorely disappointed, to my room, which had been changed to the front of the house. As I went along the corridor, I saw a large pair of boots with dirty wax tops, standing at the door of a bedchamber. They doubtless belonged to the unknown. But it would not do to disturb so redoubtable a personage in his den. He might discharge a pistol or something worse at my head. I went to bed, therefore, and lay awake half the night in a terrible nervous state. And even when I fell asleep, I was still haunted in my dreams by the idea of the stout gentleman and his wax-topped boots. I fell asleep rather late the next morning, and was wakened by some stir and bustle in the house, which I could not at first comprehend. Once more awake, I found there was a mail coach standing by the door. Suddenly there was a cry from below.
"The gentleman has forgot his umbrella. Look for the gentleman's umbrella in number 13.
I heard an immediate scampering of the chambermaid along the passage, and a shrill reply as she ran. "Here it is. Here's the gentleman's umbrella." The mysterious stranger then was on the point of setting off. This was the only chance I should ever have of knowing him. I sprang out of bed, scrambled to the window, snatched aside the curtains, and just caught a glimpse of the rear of a person getting in at the coach door. The skirts of a brown coat parted behind, and gave me a full view of the broad disk of a pair of drab breeches. The door closed. "All right," was the word, and the coach whirled off. And that was all I ever saw of the stout gentleman.